And Saagar, I think a lot of the corporate rulings that are about to come down, especially constraining the regulatory state, constraining the EPA, are going to be devastating to any ability to like do anything good for working class people in this country and move this country forward at all, let alone deal with the climate crisis.
Yeah, but I think my counter to this is the only way to do any of this is to actually just win more elections. So that just means you're going to have to be more democratic. Does that make sense? You know, you can't do any of this through the current means of power. I mean, you could. You'd have to convince people in order to do it. So,
well, but again, this goes back to the idea that politics is static. That there's nothing you can do.
Okay, but if you propose this and you lose, then that's democracy.
Right, but Biden isn't even proposing this. They're not even trying. I mean, you know, you saw Kamala Harris getting asked about some specific things that they could do with federal power, and we're not even really thinking about it. Not to mention, I mean, in FDR's case, he didn't even end up packing the court. The credible threat of doing that was enough to force the justices ultimately into line. So, listen, I mean, it's insane that you have a court that is completely out of no account whatsoever with the American people. And yes, there's a balance here because you want some separation from the democratic will so that they can uphold minority rights. But this was not meant to be a wholly unaccountable body that has no regard for the public will. Then you just have a body that's used as a political weapon for accomplishing aims that Republicans are unable to accomplish at the ballot box.
Yeah, but there's another side of that FDR story, which is that he never passed a single piece of legislation again, and it killed him politically. After 1937, after the court packing plan. It was the last thing that he ever proposed.
Otherwise, you wouldn't have the New Deal legislation. I mean, that was what cemented the ability to even have those programs and set us up for, you know, the ability to have Social Security for any of that to ultimately stand. I think we're at a precipice of the court going in a similarly radical direction as the Lochner era, where they're so pro-corporate that literally any program that you tried to pass, anything you tried to do for the American people would more or less get struck down. I mean, that's the direction they're heading in with the EPA.
I actually don't think it's the court necessarily that's going to suffer from this. I've always thought it's going to be Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans, which is that by keeping the seat open, Merrick Garland holding that up specifically, and then also coming in with Amy Coney Barrett, I think that process, judicial filibuster and more, is probably one thing that did more damage to the institution's credibility than anything else. So not even necessarily the court decision, but the process by which it gets put on. And I do think Republicans will one day probably pay for that decision, even though they did have the temporary victory of Roe. Look, I think that to do this, there is a process in place. You have to have major coalitions in Congress that are willing to do so. You have to have people on board with that. It dramatically backfired against FDR the last time that this was put into place. You can say maybe that they didn't rule more stuff unconstitutional, but it's a fact that he never recovered politically in Washington ever. Like, he even would admit it's the biggest and worst mistake that he made in his entire time in office. You can go ask his advisors. It's all actually in the book behind me. It's universally regarded as a massive overreach, as a misunderstanding of his own electoral capacity, and it rejuvenated the Senate for at least 25 years until LBJ broke it with the Civil Rights era.
Again, though, you would not have the New Deal era if he had not checked the power of the Supreme Court. You wouldn't have emancipation, you wouldn't have Reconstruction if Lincoln hadn't just
it's not
1860. Lincoln packed the court, reorganized the judiciary, and then just literally ignored their decisions and undercut their power for years, directly challenging judicial supremacy and enabling, I mean, those two instances enable basically, you know, the largest expansion of democratic rights, small d democratic rights in the country's history. I think we're at a similar point where this body has become so unaccountable. If you're someone who really does believe in democracy, the will of the people having an ability to self-govern, this is wholly separate and unaccountable. And you also just can't let justices Justice Thomas, we covered the shady dealings with his wife and financial interests at stake in the cases he's deciding on. Zero accountability there. Zero accountability for these justices who told these senators what they needed to hear in order to get onto the body, lying under oath to the American people. There has to be some accountability for elites who abuse the public trust in this way. We've had the example throughout American history of ways that the court can be checked. It has not always had the same number of seats on it as it wants. The American people are in favor of reform. And as you pointed out, Elizabeth Warren makes a good point of you actually only need 2 more Democratic senators in order to get rid of the filibuster, which in itself is archaic and arbitrary, random rule that we've been abiding by for no good reason, in order to move forward with some of these ideas.
I just think then they should run on that and they should try. I personally see a lot of—
I also think that they should try.
Yeah, well, I see a lot of cope in a lot of this, which is that the truth is that Democrats at one point had 60 seats in the U.S. Senate, not that long ago, right? Why did they lose? Well, they lost touch with a lot of people in Louisiana, Nebraska. I mean, Al Gore was from Tennessee. So you need to win elections. You need to win elections in redder states and places that you don't necessarily agree with. And
yeah,
look,
but you can't
there's
deny—
a tremendous amount of anti-democratic cope from the fact that liberals are losing elections.
But you can't deny— listen.
Yeah.
I'm not defending the Democratic Party. I think they're complete failures,
Yes.
and you're right, especially in rural America, no doubt about it. You also can't deny that the structure of this system is anti-democratic. I mean, the Senate is anti-democratic. The gerrymandering in the House, the gerrymandering in the state legislatures, the composition of the Supreme Court, and even the structure of the Supreme Court itself. I mean, I have a lot of reservations about the Supreme Court existing at all. There are countries that do not have judicial review, but if we don't want to go all the way there, the idea that they're just wholly unaccountable to the American public and really don't care, how unpopular their decisions are and how binding they are to the American public, there's just no recourse to that. I just don't fundamentally accept that. And I do think it's a problem if you are going to— we have a crisis of governance right now. It's manifest in literally every aspect of our life. If we're going to deal with that at all, we have to have a court that's going to be responsive on some level to the people, and that's going to allow the government to govern. I think we are moving in the direction opposite of that.
I don't even disagree. I mean, on the ethics point, I 100%, especially the stock trading, I didn't know. One of the only decent points Pelosi's ever made is that Supreme Court justices also are allowed to trade stock. I had no idea. I think that's crazy. I think that's fine. In general, I would just see this— I see how very clearly a lot of Republicans would look at this as a direct attack on, basically the inability of a lot of liberals to win elections. That's when a lot of this democracy talk— and look, we don't live in a direct democracy. The Senate was literally designed to be anti-democratic in order to, quote, Jefferson famously asked Washington— this could be an apocryphal story, I don't actually know, but he said, why did you put in a bicameral legislature and a Senate? And he said, why did you pour your tea into a saucer? And he said, to cool it. And Washington said, exactly so. That's the point of the Senate.
But they also didn't have the— I mean—
yeah, look, I'm not defending filibuster. I'm saying the purpose of the Senate specifically was for this purpose.
Okay, but even if you accept— which I am not a fan of the anti-democratic nature of the Senate, but even if you accept the structure of the Senate as is, the filibuster is some freaking arbitrary rule that makes no sense and that keeps us from being able— it's part of what keeps this country from being governable. I mean, it's part of why politicians win power and they're not able to do anything. Even if your ideas are bad, you should be able to implement them. And so Republicans have, to their credit, they have been able to exploit these sort of anti-democratic mechanisms within our republic, including especially the Supreme Court, and been able to achieve massive generation-defining victories that they cannot win by making the case at the ballot box. They have lost the public on abortion, gay rights, guns, unions, all of these things. They know they can't win it through the legislative process. And so instead, they have stacked the deck with the judiciary. And it is an attack on the ability of people to self-govern. And I think it has gone too far.
Yeah, I just think the only solution to that is more democracy, which we will see come November.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.